Hello and welcome back to The Spotter, the podcast for the ones who never ask for help but need it. Remember that tagline because it will be embedded into your mind eventually, if it's not already. Should be. We're only one episode in. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope you're happy and healthy. Everyone's had a good Easter, whether you celebrate it or not, just a good long weekend, good normal weekend. I hope everyone is happy and well. So, hot off, the first episode, I wanted to just say I am massively overwhelmed, in a good way, obviously, with the response to the first episode. I can't remember the amount of views we're on at the minute, but obviously that will change. So there's no point in me saying it in this episode because it's going to change and hopefully ramp up even more. But thank you to everyone that has shown support and love for the podcast, its mission, what I'm trying to do, and the message that I got across in episode 1. That was just an introduction, a bit of the origin about the spotter, the term, the name, the meaning behind what I'm doing, and what I hope to get out of this, what the future looks like for the podcast, hopefully, obviously with your help and with the people that I get on, with their help, and hopefully we can start to build a big movement that's powerful and has a real true message behind it. That's my goal, just to help people. So as a reminder, this podcast is, it's born out of my love for spotting people, helping others. That's my mission. I want to bring up the topics that no one really talks about in detail, the hard ones, the true ones, the raw, gritty ones. Keep this podcast really, truthful, and, from the heart, really. I want this to be authentic, and I want it to touch many people in different ways. And, I loved getting the comments back on the first episode. I want to be able to interact with people. That's, honestly, you wouldn't imagine how much joy it brings me to hear. I've heard things like, oh, you're a little bit of self-love here. Why not? Your voice is really good for the podcast. So I was like, yeah, that's standard. Fantastic. Thank you very much. But just things like, yeah, really liking what you're doing with this. Keep it going. I've had people talk about some issues they faced in their life already, which has given me, ideas for content in future. I've had people closest to me listening to the podcast, and, I'm just really overwhelmed with, the response. So if I can keep that up, keep the momentum up, then that's all I want. As long as you are getting takeaways from this and feeling like I am in some way helping you, maybe not directly, but in an indirect way, maybe just allowing you to think about something in particular, spur you on to do something that you maybe have been putting off, anything like that, then that is mission accomplished, really. So obviously want to talk, as I said in my first episode, there's many things I want to talk about. These first few are going to be quite a deep dive into my background. The first one was about the origins, a little bit about myself. This one's going to be talking about, I think, to be honest, a problem. Well, not a problem, but it depends on how you view it. But a topic, issue, however you want to call it, that occurs in many individuals' lives, whether it's directly through addiction or indirectly, someone in your family suffering, or you're just witness to it. Basically dealing with an alcoholic parent in your life, and what that does to an individual. I guess it depends on the personality of the individual, their relationship to you, what you see, and how that sort of I suppose impacts your your childhood, depending on how old you are or at what point in your life it impacts you. But yeah, basically, as you probably acknowledged from my first episode, my parentage has been a little bit, not, again, it's not, I'm not going to say it's their fault because it's not, sometimes we cannot, I can't even remember what the term is. We can't help. There we go. I couldn't even get help out. What the hell? Pull it together, man. You can't help sometimes the things that people get in life. Life deals cards in different ways. And it can be a real shit show for some people. And my dad, bless him, rest in peace, mate, love you always. He had, from what I understand, a really, really rough upbringing. His dad was an alcoholic, never met my granddad. His dad was an alcoholic, was, sadly quite firm with him, not in nice ways. Let's just put it that way. I'm not going to delve too deep into that because it's not really my place to be honest with you. But he didn't have a nice upbringing at all, and was basically born into a world of alcohol, and from a very young age. I think I remember being told it was from probably like the age of 13, 14, first drink down him. His dad absolutely encouraging it, almost forcing it down his throat. And then, I'm not being funny, it's like, sadly hear the thing with like any addiction, if you're almost like fed it, in quotations, from a young age, it becomes a part of you, maybe without you realising it. And, fast forward to when he was in his 40s, 50s, in my childhood, when I was growing up, I didn't see it at the time, but like looking back now, I don't think he was ever without a drink. And you don't really see it's a problem when you're a kid because you don't take these things in. But when you're older, you think to yourself, oh my God, like that's horrendous. Like in the sense of you've got that attachment to that. And, it must be horrendous for you to go through life feeling that you can't, I guess, function without something. But then on the flip side, when you turn it on its head, whilst people would deem that as probably a bad addiction, you've got what you would deem as maybe good addictions on the other side. Whereas myself, I have got a very addictive personality, and maybe that's where I get it from. I've flipped that, and I've become extremely addicted when it comes to bodybuilding. Quote unquote, looking after myself, training. Being in the gym. Like I couldn't cope without training. Like that's something that I can't cope without. So I guess on the flip side, that was his coping mechanism in life. So I don't want to. I guess shit stain it and put a real bad. I'm not here to talk bad about my dad in that way, but I just want to almost highlight the upbringing I had with being around him and alcohol, in my childhood. So basically, I don't think I ever saw Dad without I think the only time he really drank anything different was when he'd have like really strong coffee, but he'd have like 3 or 4 sugars with it. So the only other times I see him drink anything else would be that or squash, but I don't think I ever actually saw him drink squash. He would ask me to pour it for him before I'd leave. Like this was later in life. And then I'd never actually see him drink it. So maybe that was just a ploy to get me out so he could crack open a bottle of Oddy, which he loved. And obviously you can hear like trust me, in my voice, there's a bit of humour with this because, I've accepted this a long time ago. Like in my later years, the last 3 years of his life, 4 years, every Saturday, Sunday, sometimes in the week after work as well, I'd be going over to his flat and his care home when he was really ill. And I'd have the same instructions every week. I said to him each week, I was like, you don't have to tell me again. He'd be like, no, I need to tell you. That's my impression of my dad. And he'd give me a list of, spirits to get him, fags to get him, cigarettes, sweets, rubbish food, all of this malarkey. And then, I'd take it around every week, have chats with him, be present, just talk about life, old memories. And, we because of the way he was and how he treated his body, sadly, like he deteriorated a lot over the last 10 years of his life between like 2014 and, I suppose 2014 was like the peak of when I would say he was like in his best shape as a dad. In our lives as well, holidays, just enjoying him being a bit more stable, and in my life because he was in and out of it for all of the 23 years that I had him in my life, and 22 years I think actually, sorry, so basically in those last few years I was just doing the same thing each week, seeing him, taking the same. Same spirits to him, same bits of food, chatting. He'd insist on giving me 20, 30 quid for petrol. I'd say, no, I'm not taking it. And he'd chuck it on the floor and say, well, don't bother then. So I'd pick it up, obviously. You'd be a fool not to. So that was they're my latest memories of him, which, it's sad, but I'm glad I had that time with him. And I would give anything now to just take a drink round to him and just have a chat. He was my best mate. But as I'm getting older and I'm acknowledging the way I am now as a person, and I'll be honest with you, I'm in some ways, and people wouldn't really know this about me unless you've sat and spoken, I suppose, on like a deep, meaningful level. Like I've been ridden with anxiety for a long time. I'm a massive people pleaser. Like, I go out of my way to try and ensure everyone's happy, to the detriment of myself as well. And I'm a huge overthinker. You know, I'll say things, and if I think I've upset somebody, even if they take it in a jokey way or insist it was a joke, you know, that they knew it was a joke, you know, and I think that I've upset someone, I will go away and I will be in a horrendous mood. It will affect my life for a period of time. And I don't know how to switch it off. I'm trying to, you know, learn ways to get better. But I think this all stems back from being brought up in a world of alcohol, an alcoholic parent. So, you know, when I look back to like earlier childhood memories of when he was in my life, because it was in and out, like him and mum, you know, I suppose actually that's probably a good point to go back to. Mum sadly being, you know, struggling with depression, manic depression, in and out of hospital, you know, sadly struggling to cope with life and things like that. Because that's, as a depressive, that's, you know, that's what it is. A lot of individuals that struggle with depression, it's because of the way I think that their brain interprets life in its, or in that current form. So sometimes they can't deal with it. And, you know, there were times where my dad would, you know, attempt to look after me. But he, you know, there would be these, because it was such a roller coaster of him being in and out of my life, and mum and him trying to patch things up, and then they'd have like a year or two together, and then he'd be off again. You know, it was, I'd never knew if he was coming or going. So I didn't have that stability. I always had my mum present, unless she was in hospital, and then it would fall on, you know, my nan or my dad if he was present to look after me. But the type of care I got when I was with my dad compared to like my nan was completely different. Not in a really bad way, but it was. I'm seeing the way that Dad tried to almost like craft this life of him and me. It would be almost for convenience and ease for his addictions. You know, we would have things like the mattress down the stairs and, you know, in the front room to sleep on, so he wouldn't have to. I see it now, like he wouldn't have to go up the stairs if he was, I suppose, drunk, under the influence. He'd get like what he would deem as like fun food, biscuits, things like that, things that were easy for him. You know, he didn't have to cook and do that. He would make sure that I was fed and cleaned, but there wasn't that, like, you know, he would always try and ensure that all of our time together was very childlike and fun, you know, in quotes. That it was to try and make it feel like, I think, just a bit childish, you know. And I think looking back now, I think it was because I don't think he had that. Do you see what I mean? Like when you delve back into someone's background and you see how it affects you, I think that he was just so, you know, keen on creating, when it was just us two together, that bond of like a father-son that he never had with his dad, because he told me that he adored his father, even though he never got shown any love. His dad would badmouth him all the time to people, well, about him, maybe in front of people, but then he would just never show any form of love to him, and would always down him in anything he wanted to do. So my dad was, you know, a jockey when he was younger. Then he trained to be a welder. He's done, but he was always in and out of work. He was never in something consistent. But I think that's because he never had that drive and push from anyone in his life, basically, to go on and do well. Like he was always, the only thing that he had as a constant in his life was alcohol. So I see that now, and you know, I don't blame him for that. Like I guess when you take comfort in something and it brings you joy, you want to latch onto that. You know, I would never give the gym up for anyone or anything, and I see that addiction can be bad and can be good. And sadly, in his situation, it was one that completely consumed him. I think, yeah, there's definitely, I think, some traits I've got now, and the way I am, and I don't blame him for it. It's just, you know, things rub off on children. You know, this is why, you know, when you're upbringing kids, I can imagine it's quite a difficult, you know, it's a difficult task, you know, if you've got struggles in life and you want to make sure that your kids aren't influenced, but it does rub off. So I think, like, yeah, delving into like my anxieties and things like that, I'd have all of this when me and Dad were together. I would never want to disappoint him, and he was very keen on wanting to do things together. Almost like, you know, he'd say things like, well, you don't want to, when I was a little bit older, you know, going through the gaming stages as a young lad, you know, just wanting to be in Call of Duty all the time with your lads. He would if he was at home with me, mum, he would be like, why don't you come downstairs and watch a film with me tonight? And I'd be like, oh yeah, okay, could do. And he's like, no, it's okay. I understand if you want to just play with your mates. And I'd feel horrendous guilt because I know that he just wants me to go and watch a film with him and sit up late at night, but I'm seeing that all these sorts of things were not him trying to make me feel guilty, but it just did. And I felt like that. Although, sadly, I do think there were instances in my life where, he would like, and I think this is just when parents naturally sort of split from each other. Sadly, kids get caught up in the middle of it. And I think sometimes I did get a little bit caught up in the middle of it, things like, don't tell your mother. It's all right. I'm like, I'll always be the fun one, things like that. And he would use terms like that and make me feel like, even though he wasn't in my life at points, he was the fun individual and mum was the constant that, do you know what I mean? Like it would be, he would always be able to buy me like he bought me all my drum kit. He'd find a way to buy me that new game that was out. He'd find a way to buy me a TV, all these purchases as like gestures, but he wouldn't be constant in my life. He probably didn't supply financially as much as he should have, but he would find a way to please me. But I sometimes think that was almost, he had that then to say, don't worry, I'm able to do this for you, or don't worry, I'll find a way. I'll always be able to do this for you. So I don't know, maybe it was just his way of showing love. Like he'll do the grand gestures as and when he can. But yeah, it does rub off on you. Like, I had this tremendous like feeling of not wanting to disappoint him whenever we had like times together, or, I wanted to be present for him. I wanted to make sure that he knew I loved him and stuff like that, which, I know we had a great bond together. We were like best mates, but sometimes I just, I just wanted to make sure he was happy. But sadly, I don't think he was happy unless he had a drink by his side, and that's just the way in which addiction works. Sometimes, and I'm sure maybe people listening have had instances like this in their life. Maybe you've struggled with addiction yourself, and it's got to be really difficult. So yeah, I think in terms of like stemming my overthinking brain as well back to the alcohol upbringing around that. I think that, I would, for example, other instances, meeting up with him when him and mum weren't together, we'd meet up, we'd go to the cinema, do things like this. But as I was getting older, I got a bit more embarrassed because I knew that, well, sometimes in the past, there'd been in situations where he was drunk, he was pissed, things like that. And depending on the levels of drunkenness, pissedness, whatever you want to call it, how under the influence you are, it can really change the way in which you act. You start to lose control of yourself. But obviously he had a very high threshold, but I never knew if he was going to turn up drunk to a school event. I didn't know if he was going to turn up drunk to the cinema. I felt like, oh my God, I need to keep him in check. I need to keep talking to him. I need to keep him awake. I need to make sure he doesn't say certain things. There was, I never knew what the day was going to bring when I was going to see him. And I think that kept me on edge all the time. And when I was a kid, it would, he had more control over me because he was my dad. And naturally that's the nature of parents and children. You are going to have an element of control over your children because you're responsible for them. But as I got older and I was able to talk back, I was able to, argue, challenge points. He didn't like it. I think he lost this element of control over me. But flipping that on its head as well, maybe I guess that I'm trying to see other things in it. Maybe the control that alcohol had over him affected how he deemed that controlling aspect on other elements of his life. So with me, his son, and he had other children as well. So I don't know if that was the case with my siblings, but that's how I felt. I felt as I was getting older and he lost that control over me because I was a bit more of a free spirit. I was able to drive. I was able to do my own thing. I was living my life. And he didn't see me as much because obviously I was at home with mum. Maybe he didn't like the fact that he didn't have that control over me like the alcohol did with him. That's just the way I'm trying to see it. But yeah, my overthinking, I think, started to stem from those periods, I imagine. Again, I probably wouldn't know unless I went to a therapist or someone to talk through these things in detail where all of this stems from. But yeah, anxiety, overthinking, I think started to stem back from that period. I guess a question to anyone listening, like where maybe do you ever think like where these things stemmed from or stem back to for you? And it's only in the last few years that I've actually started to do that. And I've had like almost like moments where I'm walking like with my partner, Abby, and I'll be like, oh my God, like that must be why I did this. That must be why I felt that way. Or that's why I'm like this now. And you start to have these moments where you're like, that becomes clearer. And it's actually quite nice because you can take comfort in the fact that it's not something that's just manifested itself, as you've got older. It's something that, I guess it depends on how you perceive it, but, it's maybe deep rooted from childhood. But yeah, so I would always overthink. I'd wonder, like, how is he going to be today? Am I going to argue with him? Is he going to talk back to me? Am I going to upset him? I just didn't know what I was going to get. And I think that is the case with alcohol. It can really affect an individual in a way where it's not the same person you're dealing with, like day to day. And don't get me wrong, there were times where, when we were a unit as a family, like mum, me, him, he was out working when he held a job down for a period of months or whatever, like, and it was going perfectly. And you'd think, this is nice. Like, this feels like a normal family. But it was never consistent. I just never had it. Like, 6 months down the line, sadly, him and mum might have an argument. And then he would go, because obviously this was mum's house. So he wouldn't be in my life again. And then maybe 6 months down the line or 4 months down the line, he'd be back in my life for a year or 2 years, and then gone again. Like, it was a constant cycle like that. And it does play on your mind. You sort of, you overthink, you get anxious about situations. You wonder if one day someone's not going to be here, or if they are, you wonder if you're going to say something that's going to upset someone, trigger words, things like that. So I actually think I was always on edge as a kid. Wondered if I was going to get the same dad every day. Wondered if I was going to say something to upset him. I wondered if I was going to, maybe not disappoint him, not at all. Like, he was always so proud of me, whatever I did in life. That's one thing I will say about him. He was a very proud dad. He had never had a bad word to say about me, and he poured his love into me like so much. I'm blessed to say that I had extremely loving parents and a loving family, and I will always be grateful for that. I think that's one of the big takeaways I've had from my childhood, is that it's always been loving regardless of the situations and struggles we've had. He was actually, as much as I think a lot of my anxieties and maybe personality traits now stem back from that period, he was the one individual in my life that almost applauded showing emotion, even though he came from such a hard background, almost like came across as like a strong, like Cockney guy, Cockney geezer. But he didn't actually come from East London, but he just had a really, like Cockney accent. He came across as like a bit of a hard man, hard exterior, hard personality, but he was a really sensitive man, and that's where I get it from. Like, I feel very, if someone says something to me as a joke, doesn't, oh, you got small biceps. Ah, thanks. Go away and start crying for 10 days. For real though. So don't say that, please. But yeah, I actually, to any bodybuilders, say you've got small calves and they will cry. So yeah, if you're not in the bodybuilding world. But yeah, so I would, I'm like that now. I'm getting better with it, but I'm like that now. And he would always say to me, bless him, he would say, never be ashamed to cry as a man. And I think that was extremely powerful coming from a man that had struggled all his life with lack of a loving father. And, one constant in life being alcohol. He was a very sensitive guy. He always said that to me. He was like, never, ever be ashamed of shedding a tear. And if you ever need to, you just shed a tear in front of me, cry your heart out in front of me. And it never really hit me until a couple of years down the line, maybe like, I don't know, 2018, 2019. And I went through a period of counselling. Actually, I think it might have been 2020, just before COVID. But and the counselling actually got me to be a bit more in touch with my emotions. And this was for just life in general. I felt so overwhelmed with like the health issues that mum was going through. Trying to manage work, gym, social life, relationships, and I felt like I couldn't cope. So yeah, I sought the help of a It was a free counselling service, actually, in a local area. And I actually I cried for like the first session, just in buckets. And I remember the first person I told after was like, I told my dad, and I phoned him up and said, oh my God, I need to talk to you. I need to cry down the phone to you. And he was like, please just do it. So long story short, he was great when it came to that sort of thing. And I really appreciate that, because he's instilled that with me. Like I'd always, I'm a very sensitive guy, and I'll always lend an ear and lend a shoulder, lend an arm, lend a hug, whatever, to anyone. And I think in today's day and age as well, I think it's, whether or not you agree with me, I'm open to hearing disagreements as well. I think it's actually quite hard to be a male in today's society. I really do. Again, another reason why I think that me doing this podcast will help on that front as well. And yeah, I think it is hard to be a male. I think we're taught, we have been historically taught to be strong individuals that provide, down the line, not showing emotions, keeping families up together, going out to work, all of this, the historical representation of men. And I'm sure, my dad come from that era as well, where it was really, really put on you to be like, you are a breadwinner, you come and support the family. But, for him to show me that emotion as a strong individual, I always appreciated that. So that's one big takeaway I had from him. But yeah, just on the, on the alcohol front again, being that, he was addicted to that substance, that thing. I actually ended up resenting that later in life. I had a period of my life where I almost saw anyone drinking. If my mum had a glass of wine, if I saw my nan or, members of family, I'd always see that as a negative thing, because I'd been like, well, I've been around it all my life. Why do people want to do this? I just couldn't see, why people would want to drink. I just was like, what's the point? Like, if that's what it's going to do to you, because I'd seen someone was so, I guess, addicted to one thing. I was like, why does anyone else need to put that substance in their body? What's the point if that's how it's going to make you? Obviously, not knowing that that's not, there are addictive natures and addictive tendencies and sadly backgrounds that lend to that as well, and which is what he had, and he couldn't help it. That was his coping mechanism in life. And it was, I think that is, there was instances I think that I was told about in my childhood where he'd been to rehab, he'd come out, he's done, periods of time away from it, but he always found his way back to the bottle, because he loved it. And, he obviously had that big drive and, addictive nature to get back to it. But yeah, it had its knock-on effects on me. I've now got this, personality in life, and I'm not blaming it all on that, but I've got this personality in life where I feel a constant need to check in on people to see if people are okay. I feel like I have to please everyone that I come into contact with, the people around me, and it can have a really draining effect on me. I don't know how, that's another thing I'd say is, are there any other people pleasers out there? And I'm honest when I say that I am a people pleaser. It really does grain me that I'm like that. Like it isn't my responsibility to please everyone. As much as it would be nice, I can't do that. You've got to try and look after yourself first. But yeah, it does affect me. And I think my anxiety as well almost stems back to that period, in the sense that, I've worried that, my partner would leave me, more times than I'd even like to admit. I've been worried about death. I've been worried that I was going to pick up the bottle, or something even worse in life, when times were, really tough and I didn't have the gym. I was worried that I was going to go down a route that, I didn't really want to go down, but maybe I just felt like something was going to, keep me on the straight and narrow, or be like a friend or a constant companion to me, because I had that in, it was almost not in the blood, but it was in the line, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's always been a bit of a concern to me. But I think I've turned my addicted nature into, focusing on training, bodybuilding, pouring it into that, and hopefully soon helping other people with that as well, and turning, looking at it as a positive, trying to get ourselves into, better physical nick, and stuff like that. There's more to discuss, on the alcohol front, but I think that, I can't even get my words out now, being brought up in a world where one of your parents is reliant on something, it obviously has effects, you know, and I know that it's definitely molded me in a way that in a way to the person I am today, whether that's negative, not negative, whatever, positive. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's both. But I don't see alcohol as a devil substance now. You know, I occasionally have a drink, but there was a period of time where I really, really demonized it. I couldn't stand the thought of it. I was like, I'm never going to touch it. Why would I? When my dad was so reliant on it, why would I ever do that to myself? But yeah, I actually think that there came a period where I probably, ended up, especially with the gym as well, because I never had that constant control over whether or not my dad was going to be present in my life because of his addiction, because of, fallings out with my mum, because of just instability with work, providing stuff like that. I think I felt that need to control my life and my addictive nature as well. I think, via the gym, and I've channeled it through that. And I strive on routine now. I love it. I like to be able to control all my variables. I like to control all my inputs, outputs in life. I like having complete say over what, how my day goes. And I know it's not really possible. But when you do something like you setting a routine, in a bodybuilding routine, training, food, etc., I thrive off of that because I know that realistically 80% of my day is down to me and how I plan. And I've got full say in that. So I think that's just the way I am as well. I get off on that. There was a bit of a turning point though. I think so he passed away in 2021. It was October 5th, 2021. And it was at, I don't know why I feel the need to say it. It was at 5:15. I was there, bless him, when he passed away, and very traumatic. Very traumatic. No one ever wants to see their parent pass. And again, that molded me. It did change my perception on life a little bit. And hence why I'm doing the podcast now. I'm like, what have I got to lose? Life can be taken like that. And, some people can just go on living and living and living. But, you really just have to, it's so cliche. People saying, you got to do what you love. Like, honestly, the amount of times I've wanted to just pick up a microphone and crack on with something like a podcast is ridiculous. So here we go. Like, I'm actually sticking with it now, and I'm really pleased. I feel like I'm growing as I'm doing these episodes. I'm very proud of myself, and I'm sure he would be as well. But yeah, his death, he actually died of COPD. I can't remember the full term of that, but it's I think it's to do with your lungs, breathing, things like that. I think that was after a fall when he was in the care home, because he was in a care home he was in a couple of care homes for the last portion of his life. Obviously still with his, addiction and things like that. He was always saying he was aware that he was going to die at some point. And I'd always brush it off, but I think deep down I knew that as well. But his death, as much as it was traumatic, I think it was a bit of a, it was a turning point for me as well. I feel like there was a bit of relief for me in the sense of, I knew that he was at peace. He wasn't having to struggle through life. He wasn't having to, worry about when the next bottle was coming in or who was going to bring it. Was he going to get what he needed? That was, there was an element of peace there. I didn't have this feeling of conflict, none of that. I had all of the happiest memories came to surface, and, I didn't really think much about the alcohol side of things, but I think my view of him's changed now. I just think he was, I think he was a very troubled man that saw alcohol as a way of comfort in his life, and I guess some form of happiness to allow him to escape maybe a childhood that he never wanted or wanted to be born in. And I think he tried to basically ensure that I had as much of a childhood as possible when I was with him, and that we were almost like best friends. I feel like he wanted that really tight, close-knit relationship with me that he never had with his father, and he just wanted to pour love into me, but at the detriment of pouring alcohol into himself. And that was just obviously his way of being able to do both. So I think, in the grand scheme of things, I've been able to look back at, my childhood and accept that whilst it wasn't perfect, it was my childhood, and sadly, he wasn't able to control, as much as people would say, well, of course I can, well, he obviously couldn't, he couldn't control his addiction, other than to, supplement it and keep it running. And yes, granted, you could say, well, I was adding to that later in life, but I'm sorry, when someone's, had something in their life, all of their life, I'm not going to be the person to take that away from them, because I know full well a man at 60, 61, 62, he died at 63. I know he's not going to change. I just know. So as much as it pained me to take things to him, in his latter stages, I knew that it was never going to change. And that was his one bit of happiness, was that, and seeing myself, seeing his other kids and things like that as well. But, just having those conversations with him, living out those last memories with him, it was, it meant a lot to me in those last years. But no bad blood. He was my best friend. He was just riddled with addiction. And yeah, I think that growing up with an alcoholic parent has definitely shaped me in more ways than one, as you could probably tell. And I guess a bit of closing reflection for all of you would be, not really takeaways. I hope that people have taken away something from this anyway. And maybe, if there's anyone that's struggled with addiction themselves, if that is alcohol, or they've had people in their lives that have struggled with it as well, I really hope that this has almost spoken to you volumes in that sense. But, there's going to be people that have, sadly, addiction in life to many substances, things, places, whatever. And some of them are good, some of them bad. I mean, who are we to decide what's good and bad, I guess? I mean, it's, I think society will do that anyway. But I guess that, yeah, I hope that people have had some takeaways from this as almost like a growing up with an alcoholic parent episode. There might be more on this. I don't think this is the full chapter of this one closed, but I wanted to do almost like a bit of a part 1 of 2, 3, as to a bit more of my background, what I've grown up with. So you've had like the things I've got now: anxiety, people pleaser, overthinker, which are, they're things I'm going to delve into in the coming episodes. Maybe bring my partner into it and do some, dual, back and forth, and then talk a bit more about, depression, manic depression, my mum, various illnesses, and, growing up with that as well, and how that's shaped me. And again, it might speak volumes to other people. But like I said, the goal with this is to just, basically start conversations and get people thinking, get people talking about difficult conversations, and hopefully it all helps, everyone down the line, or some people anyway. And then, yeah, the long-term goal of the podcast is to get some really cool names on the podcast, some brands, people with good messages, and, we just keep the movement growing and spread awareness for all these, topics, issues, and, tough subjects that we don't hear enough about. And we keep building the awareness campaign, mental health to the front and centre. So yeah, I hope that you've had some good takeaways from this. I hope I've not bored you. I hope it's been still a little bit lighthearted and funny in moments. And yeah, stay tuned for the next one. This has been The Spotter, episode 2. Let's keep the movement growing. Take care, everyone.